Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to present in this seminar. I study live film translation, film festivals, and the Soviet experience of foreign cinema during the Cold War. Today we'll be talking about Arab cinema in the USSR and the key role of simultaneous film translation in Soviet experience of Arab cinema. I will first talk about the official distribution of Arab films in the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s, and then I will consider alternative forms of distribution, such as international film festivals and weeks of Arab films that traveled throughout the Soviet Union in this period. Before 1969, the Soviet Union bought very few Arab films for distribution. At the time, states bought and sold films according to the principle of parity, as a form of cultural diplomacy. If a foreign country bought a number of films from the USSR, ideally the USSR had to buy the same number of films from that foreign country. For example, in 1969, a delegation from Egypt came to the USSR to see a foreign Egyptian co-production, a documentary, Hello, the Nile River, about the construction of the Aswan Dam on the Nile, and buy and sell films. Egyptians bought 10 Soviet films, and the Soviet bought 8 Egyptian films. In practice, the parity in film distribution rarely happened. In 1967, for example, the USSR bought no films from Arab countries at all. From the entire North Africa and the Middle East, only Egyptian films circulated in the 60s. In 1964, a delegation from the United Arab Republic came to Moscow to sell more films, but only 2 were bought the following year. In 1969, when Egyptian delegation sold 8 films, it was a unique success. In the following years, Soviet audiences often saw every year between 3 and 7 Egyptian films, plus sometimes 1 picture from Syria, Lebanon, or Tunisia. Most Egyptian films shown in general distribution were melodramas with singing and dancing. They were very popular, along with Indian and Mexican melodramas. Mexican film Yesenia, the all-time leader of the Soviet box office, reached 91 million spectators in 1975. In comparison, Egyptian melodrama The White Dress, made in 1973, played in Soviet theaters in 1976. It was a story about a tragic love affair between a man from a wealthy prominent family and a simple shop girl. It reached 61 million spectators, making it the 7th most popular film ever screened in the USSR. Today, the film remains popular, and Russian viewers can see it in the dub version, the original dub version, on YouTube and other video channels. At the time, film critics worried that the popularity of these melodramas demonstrated the political and aesthetic ignorance of Soviet audiences. Outside of official circulation, Soviet viewers saw many more Arab films from diverse countries. These films were shown in international film festivals and foreign film weeks, and this is the kind of spectatorship that I'm interested in. As the post-war Soviet Union opened up its cultural borders, it aimed to compete with the first world Western powers from the attention of the decolonizing and unaligned third world countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. After Joseph Stalin's death in 1953, international festivals and foreign film weeks came one after another. The Indian Film Week in 1954, the International Youth Festival in 1957, the Moscow International Film Festival in 1959, and the Festival of Asian and African Cinema in Tashkent in 1968. Foreign film weeks began with the Indian Film Week and continued into the 80s. These smaller scale festivals began in Moscow and then traveled to other major cities in Russia and other republics. These festivals usually showed between 5 to 10 films, translated live via a microphone. Filmmakers from the country of origin also traveled with the films. For example, during the 1964 Egyptian Film Week, director Salah Abu Saif and actress Nadia Lutfi traveled with their films to Moscow, Leningrad, and Baku in Azerbaijan. 2 of the films featured in the lineup were bought for general distribution, Days Without Love and Internally Faithful. Another film week of Algerian films took place in November-December 1968. I don't have a full list of Arab film weeks during this period, but usually there were 2 or 3 every year from foreign countries, and I expect that probably at least every other year there was a week of films from an Arab country as well. I know Tunisia had weeks, and some other countries also. Large-scale cinematic international contacts began in earnest in 1957 at the International Youth Festival in Moscow. This festival demonstrated the two unique features of Soviet festivals: large number of Asian and African participants, and voice-over simultaneous translation of films. The International Film Festival, conducted in conjunction with the Youth Festival, included 125 films from 30 countries, judged by a jury of filmmakers and critics from Western and Eastern Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, including Arab films. The Moscow and Tashkent festivals took place in alternating years, and both used translators from Moscow. Latin American films were represented in Tashkent as early as 1974. 2 years later, the festival was renamed as the African, Asian, and Latin American Film Festival. The Moscow Festival also publicized and awarded prizes to films from Senegal, Algeria, Iran, and Latin America, especially Cuba, often for political reasons. So here you can see that first Moscow Festival had 5 Arab countries represented already, and they grew after that. And the first Tashkent Festival in '68 had a lot more, as you can see. Again, Egypt had the most films, 9 feature films and 1 short, but still a lot more countries were represented, and even 2 countries that didn't have big cinematographies, at least they brought representatives. After Moscow and Tashkent festivals, films and filmmakers traveled to major cities and capitals of Soviet republics, including Leningrad, Kiev in Ukraine, Tbilisi in Georgia, Dushanbe in Tajikistan, Baku in Azerbaijan, and others. Films shown during these festivals were not dubbed but had voiceover translation from the loudspeakers. In 1974, critic Gordon Hitchens reported in Variety magazine on the 3rd Tashkent Festival for African and Asian cinema. He described at length the perils of translation at Tashkent. Each film was translated live, first into Russian, broadcasted through the theater's loudspeakers over turned-down original soundtrack, and then into the languages of the various foreign guests, who listened through transistor headphones. The second-order translation came up to half a minute later than the original utterance, making the narrative very difficult to follow. Despite his frustration, Hitchens praised the ugly Soviet interpreting method because a great number of films in so many languages, often obscure, participate in Tashkent. To Western observers like Hitchens, simultaneous interpreting at Tashkent gave a unique opportunity to view films totally unknown outside their area. In comparison with official distribution, the lineup at festivals at Cinema Weeks was much more diverse. In '75, only 9 Arab films from 2 countries circulated in the USSR via official distribution. In the previous year, 10 countries and the Palestine Liberation Organization brought films to Tashkent. These included, that's actually in the previous slide. These included Algeria, Tunisia, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt, who also sold films to Soviet distribution. But the lineup also included new cinemas of Morocco, Kuwait, Yemen, and Jordan. These festivals featured the widest selection of Arab cinema: Egyptian blockbusters shot by Syrian students from VGIK, Old Union State Film School in Moscow, liberation cinema of Palestine, and more. Arabic was so prominent at the Tashkent Festival that in 1974, Arab participants proposed to make it an official language of the festival, in addition to Russian, English, and French. That year, Arabic was a native language of over 2/3 of Tashkent participants. Okay, and this is an example of the Moscow Festival in '77 that also has a larger list of Arab countries represented than, say, the first Moscow Film Festival. So it grew as the decade progressed. Okay, so now I'll be talking about the origin of translation system in the Soviet Union. Soviet foreign film spectatorship depended on the practice of 2-tiered simultaneous interpreting, which was unique to the Soviet Union. In Russia, simultaneous translation was first used informally during the Sixth Communist International Congress in 1928. Systematic professional simultaneous translation of speeches and testimony dates back to the Nuremberg trials, where each foreign delegation translated the proceedings into its own language, and the Americans translated into German. Two-tiered interpreting was a Soviet improvement on the Nuremberg system, which was first used during the 1952 International Economic Congress in Moscow. The system delayed the translation and exacerbated errors, but used fewer interpreters at once and did not depend on translators fluent in two foreign languages, which made it easier to cover more languages. Speeches at the 22nd Communist Party Congress in 1961 were translated using the latest equipment to and from 29 languages, including Vietnamese, Indonesian, Korean, Japanese, as well as Arabic and several rare African languages. As a result, Nikita Khrushchev's famous announcement at the Congress that the current Soviet generation would see implementation of national communism reached a wider international audience. Oral interpretation of film actually goes back to early history of cinema. Starting in about 1910, live commentators were interpreting silent foreign films everywhere in the world. And the previous speaker at this seminar talked about that. The most artful of them, Benshi, dressed in kimonos and took turns performing each character's role on stage to the side of the screen in a sing-song kabuki style, accompanied by traditional Japanese string, wind, and drum instruments. Within 5 years, this performance interpreted them loosely. In 1921, when Benshi amended the line from D.W. Griffith's Offerings of the Storm, the French Revolution rightly overthrew a bad government, to match his own skeptical take on Western democracy. The French political strife was caused by a tradition of bad governing, and the consequences of this were worse. Benshi were so popular and respected, the Japanese moviegoers initially rejected sound films, which, when they first hit screens, confined Benshi performances to word-free breaks between spoken dialogue. In the 20s, the Soviet government had circulated silent foreign films in the newly formed Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in mobile cinemas called kinoperedvishki, usually accompanied by the political commentary of lecturer ideologues. These lecturers condemned the capitalist film producers in their introductions and translated written intertitles in a way that omitted ideologically suspect parts. In the same silent era, parliamentarians of France, Quebec, and Francophone West Africa stood next to the screen and interpreted intertitles as well. So there are many examples from all over the country and Iran as well, as we know now. But as silent films became replaced by talkies, live commentators retreated from cinema halls around the world. In many cases, they were chased away by film goers themselves. Benshi, too, were leaving the cinema stage, forced out by Japanese cinephiles who wanted an authentic experience of Western sound films, unadulterated by local tradition. Years later, Abe McNorns, a film historian and writer of English subtitles for Japanese movies, called their performances abusive translation. Without it, the dialogue was more accurate, but an afternoon in the cinema became less personal and eccentric. And I should say that the humor and kind of free-form translation in these early silent examples transferred to the Soviet experience as well, as we shall see. Soviet film translators from the 50s inherited this tradition. To translate a foreign film live in the Soviet Union, one needed only a projector, a loudspeaker, a screen, and an audience. No need to dress up. Interpreters delivered lines from the back of the cinema hall, never from stage. There was a special film theater in Moscow for art and foreign films, and usually translators who later went to Moscow or Tashkent or did the Film Week translations, they usually started at this theater. It was called Illusion. Sometimes at other theaters, not the well-equipped theater, they just leaned against the rear wall when the booth for translators was not available. They also translated at New Year's junkets at government offices and Politburo dachas, which offered the luxury of a chair. Clubs for intelligentsia and screening rooms for the party elite threw in a microphone and headphones. Festival screenings added a table and a lamp to read the foreign dialogue lists. all the spoken lines in the film in chronological order. Unfortunately, these lists were not always available. I should also say that a lot of foreign students at VGIK, the Soviet Film School, they also, their way of learning about foreign cinema was also viewing films with simultaneous translation, and usually these films were delivered from foreign embassies and watched either late at night or early in the morning, and then returned to the embassies as soon as possible because the screenings were not official. And I interviewed a Moroccan filmmaker who went to VGIK in the late 60s, and he remembered watching these films in such a manner. Beginning with the film program accompanying the 1957 International Youth Festival in Moscow, Soviet festivals chose simultaneous film interpreting as the standard. Because of organizational shortcomings, simultaneous interpreting into Russian over the loudspeaker was often extemporaneous, done without any pre-screening. Written translations of dialogue for reading during screenings were often incomplete or not available. The term interpreting thus applies loosely to this practice. At different times during the same screening, the simultaneous film interpreter into Russian would read from an already transcribed dialogue list, translate from a dialogue list in a foreign language, interpret directly from the soundtrack, or make up the dialogue when the vocal track was in an unfamiliar language and neither subtitles nor script were available. And again, Arab films usually fell into the category where either translator didn't know the language of the film and relied on the subtitles, or there would be a whole scene or a whole reel of film where subtitles were just omitted. Foreign guests suffered live translation together with millions of Soviet cinephiles. At all festival theaters in Moscow and Tashkent, each film was first translated into Russian, played through the theater's loudspeakers, and then into the languages of the various foreign guests who listened through transistor headphones. That meant that an Arab guest would not hear the original soundtrack of an Arab language picture, but an Arab translation of a Russian translation, which came half a minute after the original dialogue. Occasionally, such free-form relay interpretation added humor to the film. One foreign journalist reported that he had heard at a Soviet festival the English language expression, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak," translated to a foreign language and then back into English as "the drinks are pretty good, but the meat is lousy." Translators from Russian into foreign language could also add their own slant to the dialogue intentionally. Gordon Hitchens witnessed such an addressee at a screening of an Uzbek film, Riders of Revolution, at the 1968 Tashkent Festival. As Hitchens describes it, the English language earphone translation of the Uzbek original was often very ironic. A wounded Red Army scout escapes from the enemy lines and collapses at the feet of the Bolshevik leaders, riddled with bullets and gasping out his last breath. The leader bends down and speaks to him. The voice on the earphone says, "Well now, what's the matter?" in a petulant and irritated voice. Such simultaneous interpreting became part of the film. Theorist Michel Chion proposes a notion of emanation speech in cinema, the speech which is not necessarily heard or understood fully, including instances where characters speak one or more languages not translated for the audience. This applies to a film shown with simultaneous translation. Foreign guests complained they could not hear original soundtrack behind Russian megaphone translation. Interpreters had to make up scenes when they could not hear or did not know the original language. When they were not quick enough to invent dialogue, their audiences heard incomprehensible speech. So hundreds of foreign and millions of domestic spectators flocked to Soviet festivals to see movies from a position of partial linguistic incompetence. To be sure, film festivals in Western Europe use simultaneous translators also, but European translators had a minimalist view of live screen translation. Venice Film Festival translator David Snelling, for example, would not have had the translator use any verbal inflections at all, making no distinctions between "would you like a cup of tea?" "What would you say to a cup of tea?" "Wouldn't a cup of tea be super?" and "have some tea?" as these social distinctions would be abundantly clear from costume and mimicry. T, with an interrogative intonation, is the only minimal disturbance alternative, he argued. Soviet translators instead spent multiple screenings perfecting their rendition of particular phrases. The best simultaneous film translators thought of themselves as practitioners of an improvisational sound art. Interpreter Grigory Liborgal explained, "When you are watching a film with a simultaneous translation, you, the viewer, have to clearly hear the original soundtrack of the film. If the translator is a master of his craft, he will not dominate the screen, speak on top of the actors. If he is a virtuoso, if he can feel the balance between the film proper and his own voice, after several minutes the spectator in the theater will forget about the translator, feeling that he himself can understand English, French, or Japanese." So how did this work for the Arab cinema? Some translators of Arab cinema took great pains to study the language and context for the films. In the 60s, Vitaly Naumkin, then a student of Arabic culture and now the director of the Oriental Student in Moscow, moonlighted as a simultaneous film translator. In his memoirs, Naumkin describes translating the film Al-Haram, The Sin, a film from 1965, based on a novel by Yusuf Idris. One scene showed the hand of an Egyptian peasant woman breaking an egg on a stone in an open field. Puzzled by the scene, Naumkin consulted his mentor, an Egyptian communist and ethnographer Hamdi Salam. Salam explained that the woman was given birth in secret. Breaking an egg helped her to go through the birth without help of a midwife. Naumkin remembered that watching Egyptian films was the best primer for him to learn about everyday Egyptian customs. Other film interpreters weren't so lucky. Often at Tashkent, interpreters from English or French were asked to translate non-Western films in languages they did not know from dialogue lists or subtitles. But these promised lists and titles did not always materialize. For example, at the 1968 Tashkent Festival, another film translator was supposed to interpret an Iraqi documentary from French subtitles. But when the film began, he saw no subtitles. The only word he could understand was Baghdad. He asked the projectionist to run only the first and last reel, to show only 20 minutes out of 40, but had to invent voiceover for the rest. In what he considers an inspired moment, once during the film he turned from describing the natural beauty of water reserves to water as the source of energy, and at the next moment footage of a hydroelectric station appeared on the screen. And these kind of narratives were pretty common when I interviewed translators about their work. Basically, even when they didn't know the language or didn't understand the scene, they felt like they could become one with it, and they could intuit what was said even though they didn't understand the language. During tours to Soviet republics after the festival, each translator was usually given 2 films to translate live in a language he or she knew, usually English or French, and 2 films in a language she didn't know, such as Arabic or Hindi, to translate from a script. I recalled one film translator, that when you translate such a film from the 20th time, you begin to zone in that culture, and it was useful to not just experience the familiar European culture, but something else. Often the dialogue lists were missing several scenes, but by the 4th or 5th time, I would invent translators of the scenes by myself. The idea of soaking in another culture through multiple exposures. So it seems to explain why simultaneous translators claim to understand speech in films and languages that they did not know, and routinely agreed to translate from languages they did not speak fluently. Despite these difficulties, live translation in Tashkent and Moscow also bring together a great number of non-Western filmmakers to view and discuss their films. It was a forum for African and Arab students from the Soviet Film School to showcase their films and meet other filmmakers from Africa and Asia. And I actually asked a Sudanese filmmaker once why he kept going to Tashkent even though he could have gone to Carthage or Ouagadougou for a festival, and he said that he would be invited to Ouagadougou or Carthage, but he would not be able to go because these festivals didn't pay for filmmakers to come, whereas the Soviet Union actually provided transportation for all non-Western guests. including former VGIK students, and especially invited former VGIK students always to come. So he came because he could see other African filmmakers at Tashkent for free. That was really important to him. And the translators made it possible for Soviet audiences to encounter an unprecedented variety of non-Western cinema. I also should say that audience also enjoyed meeting the filmmakers when films traveled after film festivals with the filmmakers accompanying them. There was a possibility to directly speak to the audiences after the film. There was always a Q&A session after, and usually filmmakers remember that quite fondly. Other European festivals provided forums for third world filmmakers to interact with each other and with filmmakers and critics from the West and Soviet bloc. After 1974 Tashkent festivals, Indian critic Devendra Kumar noted that Karlovy Vary was the first festival to provide a forum for discussion effort among third world filmmakers. Festivals in Pesaro, Italy, and Leipzig, East Germany, provided a forum for radical third world filmmakers. For example, the Palestinians who were in Tashkent in 74, I'll talk more about them later, they also went to Leipzig in the following year. There were a Pan-African festival in Burkina Faso, an Arab African festival in Carthage, and a Latin American festival in Cartagena and Vina del Mar. Still, the wide range, a great number of countries, and filmmakers participating in Tashkent surpassed all other festivals. European observers found the intensity of informal interaction in Tashkent unprecedented. And usually part of the interaction, both in Moscow and Tashkent, would be these parties where people would, where local filmmakers, say Uzbek filmmakers at Tashkent, would throw a dinner and invite Cuban or Indian delegation to perform. And there would always be excursions to nearby cities in nearby republics as well, so to Tajikistan or Turkmenistan, and during these trips filmmakers could interact as well. For example, there was a report by an Afghani filmmaker from 1974 who remembered talking with other foreign guests at the festival on a train to Dushanbe until 4 hours in the morning. Arab filmmakers too benefited from this conviviality. Egyptian delegation of the 1974 Tashkent Festival claimed that the informal atmosphere at the festival helped them to sell more films to Arab countries. Palestinian filmmakers who came to the same festival. Oh yeah, so this is a roundtable discussion at the Tashkent Festival. It was always done around this table, and they were all recorded and published after. And that's another example how even theoretical discussions about cinema were possible at Tashkent among a variety of filmmakers. And the spectatorship at these festivals, it doesn't just refer to a spectatorship by Soviet audiences, but also by filmmakers themselves. Palestinian filmmakers who came to the 1974 festival found support for their films from Western and Arab states. Soviet Tashkent was a stop in their international network of support. Tashkent showed their films, the USSR provided their cameras, Iraq and Syria produced their films, and Lebanon served as a base of operation. And for Soviet audiences as well, if you guys remember the big theaters that I showed that were official theaters for the festivals, some of them had over like 13,000 seats. There was a theater in Moscow with 13,000, and there was a theater in Tashkent with 6,000 seats, and they were usually full during these festivals. And what happened is the audiences would be really vocal. So if they liked the film, they would clap or shout after. And then if they didn't like the film, they would just all get up and leave right away. And in the big theaters, it was quite impressive. There's an article by a journalist from Switzerland who describes Uzbeks getting up during a film by a Filipino filmmaker and just walking out all together. And of course, Egyptian journalists reported that Egyptian melodramas did really well, and there were sold out screenings during the festival. To conclude, these numerous festivals and screenings, more than the few Arab pictures selected and dubbed for national distribution, conveyed the reception of Arab cinema in the Soviet Union. Thanks to live translation, the films acquired what Naoki Sakai calls heterolingual address, a fundamental determination of your addressee as the one who might not comprehend your language, that is, of the foreigner. Artisanal and inexact practice of live interpreting encourage spectators to make aesthetic and political discoveries in our films. Thank you.